I already have quite a lot of Pokemon cosplay, but I decided I needed at least one more of them, so I made an Umbreon cosplay. Umbreon is the dark type evolution, and as such is mostly black in colour. With fully black clothing, cameras and bright lights tend to erase small details, so I wanted to create a cosplay that focuses a lot more on silhouette rather than adding small details like ruffles or stitching work. Somewhere along the lines of thinking of ideas that really went well with silhouettes and Umbreon's design, I really honed in on this image of a jester. I just love how jesters have horned hoods that cover their shoulders and sometimes their arms, and I thought this image overall went really well with Umbreon's design because he's very sleek but he's also very purposely done. Using that image as a base, I designed a cosplay which consisted of a horned hood complete with arms over the top of a bodysuit and finished off with a pair of black pleated shorts. I also decided to add chains to give it more of a fighting ready look. When designing it, I went back and forth on whether I wanted to do a regular Umbreon or a shiny Umbreon, but I eventually went with the shiny Umbreon because it meant that I could reuse a piece of a cosplay that I'd already made. Back in May last year, I made a Toothless cosplay wherein I used this amazing iridescent blue scalloped fabric to make multiple elements of the cosplay, one of which was this very simple bodysuit with a high neckline. I'll go into a lot more detail on how I made this piece in particular in that video, but the short explanation is that I traced around a bodysuit that I already owned to get the front and the back, sewed them together and added on a collar and some buttons at the crotch so I could take it on and off. I love that I get to reuse this piece because I don't often find ways to reuse old pieces without cutting them apart, because I feel like a lot of them are very specific to that character, even if pieces like this don't necessarily read as their characters as standalone pieces. Cosplay can get very expensive very quickly, so recycling old cosplay or your everyday clothing for a new one is a really good way to save money and make a cosplay feel a little bit more accessible. Obviously it's a lot harder to get screen accurate cosplays doing it this way, but it's a really good starting point if you just want to see if cosplaying is for you or you just want a much cheaper option. The horned hood part of this cosplay started out as an old polo shirt that I used to wear for job interviews. I don't need it for my current job, so it's a really good piece that I need to upcycle. This shirt made a really good base for this hood because it's quite long and I knew I wanted it really cropped, so I knew I'd have all this fabric to use for the hood itself. To crop the shirt, I started out by marking exactly where I wanted the cropping to be. I did this about 1 centimeter lower than I was planning to have it eventually because I knew I wanted to do a rolled hem on this. This shape was more of a curve than I normally go for, but I've realised recently that very short crop tops tend to look a lot better if the front is a lot shorter than the back, with a gradual curve connecting those two lengths around the side of the body. Surprisingly, I found this part one of the harder aspects of making this section look good, because it's really difficult to cut something that is already sewn together without cutting both sides of the clothing at once. At least I personally find it rather irritating to do. And I also haven't done this shape of crop top before, so I did have to cut it a few times while trying it on in between to get the look that I wanted to. The hem definitely changed the shape of this slightly and doesn't make it hang as nicely as I wanted it to because it's a little bit stiffer along the edge. But with this particular design, I needed that hem to be in place so that when I hang the chains on it later, they aren't going to rip through the fabric and just fall off. So while it's better for the cosplay as a whole, I do wish I didn't have to put a hem on this. Next, I started making the actual hood element of this cosplay. This started out as a very rough head shape sewn into a double layered piece of fabric that I then slowly fit to my head over numerous alterations. I don't think I quite got the shape perfect, but I was finding it really difficult to pin the fabric at the back of my head, and while I do have a mannequin head, our sizes just aren't very compatible, so it wouldn't have ended up any better if I used that instead of doing it on my own head. I think what I want to do is make a personal mannequin head by making a pattern out of my head by taping my head up. It's a very common method of making fitted clothing, but just saying it with no context does sound a little bit weird. But once I made a pattern, I could then sew the head shape into the exact same shape and size of my own head that I could just slip over my current mannequin head and stuff until it's solid. I think I'll only do that if I have a lot more plans to make headwear in the future, because there is a risk that I would cut my hair while making the pattern pieces, and I don't want to cut my hair if I never actually use the final result. With my outer layer cut out, I then decided to make the lining fabric out of that really nice blue iridescent fabric that I use for the bodysuit. I really like when my cosplays feel a little bit more cohesive, so I thought this would be the perfect way to do this, especially as the collar from the bodysuit would already be seen from underneath the hood. I didn't have a lot of this fabric left, so it was a little bit of a struggle to get the pieces necessary for this, but I just about managed to do it. I just don't have any scraps left of that fabric, which is really sad because I really do like this fabric. With both the outer layer and inner layer all cut out, I then sewed it all together. Each fabric type was sewn together separately all the way along that center parting to create two fully formed head pieces. To sew these pieces together, I just put them together right sides together and sewed all the way around the face hole. This gives a really nice, clean and professional look with no exposed seams, but it's also super easy to do, especially as because I wasn't overly fussed about a little bit of the lining layer peeking through around the edges I created. If you don't want that lining layer visible, you just have to fold over the outer layer in a little bit, sew it into place, and then iron along that line to create a new edge. It's the type of thing that takes a really long time to do but isn't necessarily really hard to do. I just didn't feel like it was necessary for this particular cosplay piece. Now that I had both the hood and the shirt base, I could sew them together. This part was really easy for me because the manufacturer of the shirt technically did a lot of the work for me. All I had to do was remove the original collar, and then I had the perfect space to sew the hood into that already had ironed down seam allowance and everything. When I've made hooded clothing in the past, I've really struggled with this part of the project, the combining of the hood and the shirt. So it was nice to get a good look at one method of attaching these pieces together, so I can hopefully create something similar next time I want to make a piece like this. Having that hole to slide the hood into was also really helpful in terms of placement. I could put the pieces into place, pin them together, and put it on to really get a good idea of what the final product was going to look like before I made it permanent. Well, technically not permanent, but more permanent than I would like it to be if I wasn't happy with the outcome. Sewing really is great because you can do things over and over again until you have the perfect result, but for me personally, I just don't have the patience to redo things. So it's really helpful to have a step where I can really check if I've got everything in the right place before I make any stitches. Next, I could finally make the horns to go onto the hood. These were really simple. All I did was cut out the shape that I wanted, sew around the edges, flip them the right side out, stuff them until they were really solid, and then sew them into place. The long part of this section was definitely sewing them onto the hood itself because I had to do it all by hand using a curved needle, and my curved needles are very big and not very sharp, so they didn't mesh really well with this particular project. But regardless of how long it took, I'm really happy with how the horns came out, and I'm very glad I went with this direction for Umbreon. I tend to use a lot of wigs for my cosplays because it's always been ingrained in my head that cosplays need wigs, but I just don't like wigs. I don't like wearing them, I don't like styling them. I really struggle to design hairstyles because I don't do anything with my own hair, so I don't really understand how hairstyles work or how to make them. I just don't really have an interest in hair, so I really want to design more cosplays so they have hood pieces or head pieces that I can just wear with my natural hair. After the horns were in place, I could then finish off the hood by adding on the chains. I think this would have been easier if I had some sort of tools to do it with, but I did it all by hand and it wasn't too bad to get on. If it involved more chains or more intricate designs, I think I would have struggled a lot more, but seeing as it was just simple loops of chains, it wasn't too hard on my fingers. To attach them, I first stabbed a jump ring through the fabric in the position that I wanted the chains to hang, and then divided up my chains into the length that I wanted for that section and threaded onto the ring before repeating it on the other side. When I first did this, I made the chains really long, but I did later decide to shorten them just a little so they weren't hanging quite so low. I find that chains can get really annoying because they hit things, so having them at the first length just felt like I was going to be knocking things over all the time, especially if I wore it to a convention where I'm leaning over the tables. The second shorter length just felt a little bit more manageable. I've never added chains to cosplays before. I've actually never added chains to anything permanently before, so it was really fun to try out a different method of adding a new interest to a piece of clothing. The final step of the hood was painting on all of those blue circles that are present in Umbreon's design. Paint wise, I mixed up a light blue as close as I could get to the colour of Canon Shiny Umbreon. I do feel like it's a little too light, but at the same time the circles do glow, so I think erring on the lighter side of things is a good way to get a colour that feels more accurate to the character rather than going with one that's too dark. Once I had a colour I liked, I then added fabric medium to it. This just makes the paint more susceptible for sticking to clothing and surviving the wash. I've been using fabric medium for a good few months now, and it can be a little bit hit or miss for me. It's most likely user error on my part because I'm never sure on how much to add to get the results that I want to, but it's super helpful when it comes to customizing clothing and making them a lot more unique than I ever could with sewing alone. Accurate details like circles are just really difficult to sew, especially if you have to sew everything twice. I would have had to sew the rings as individual pieces and then sew them onto the shirt itself. Basically, it's 2 chances to mess everything up and end up with jagged edges or slightly too many straight lines, so painting them on is just miles easier and more effective. Because it's a very light colour going on a very dark fabric, I did have to do 4 layers to get the desired results, so it took quite a while for me to get what I was going for, but for most of that time it was just drying, so I didn't feel like it was a super long process, especially as I was so happy with how much this paint transformed the hood. It took it from a very generic design into one that was very obviously inspired by Umbreon. Overall, the paint really brought together this aspect of the cosplay, and I'm so glad I included it because otherwise it just wouldn't have read as Umbreon. With the hood finished, finished, I then moved on to the shorts, the first step of which was cutting out all the pieces that I would need. For this, I decided to divert from my original design and go for a more basic short design because I just didn't have as much black fabric as I thought I did. I got this fabric for my unknown work trousers, and this is all I have left of it, so making a pleated short was just too complicated. Pattern-wise, I traced around a pair of trousers that I liked the fit of, and just eyeballed the length I wanted to go for. They do end up being a little bit too short on accident, but I do think they're very reminiscent of Len from Vocaloid, which is a cosplay that I've always wanted to do. So maybe it's a good thing that I now have a piece that I can use for more cosplays rather than just a piece that I can just use for this cosplay. With all my pieces cut out, I then sewed on the way that I would get into these trousers, which for these particular ones would be snap buttons. To make a nice neat section where these buttons will eventually go, I went through a very similar process on how I insert zippers, but without sewing the two sides together. This process involves sewing cover panels onto the inside of both pieces of the trousers, sewing them together with the crotch seam, and then sewing a neat stitch on the outside of these panels, just to make everything hold nicely while wearing the trousers. These panels will basically allow me to sew the snap buttons on later on without the stitching being visible from the outside, because I have an extra layer of fabric that I can sew them to instead. With that section all finished, I then added some pockets. I need pockets in all my outfits because I don't tend to carry a bag with me, and this is also true when I'm cosplaying, as I don't have enough bags that match the vibes of my characters. Luckily for me, I have gotten the hang of sewing practical and nice looking pockets recently because I've just done them so many times. What I do is I cut out a section where I want the pocket to go, sew an additional piece of fabric directly onto the edges that I just cut that is the length of the pocket that I want, flip the piece onto the inside of the shorts, sew a backing piece onto the additional piece, and then top stitch over all my edges and down the front of the opening to make it lay nice and flat. This style of pocket just looks so much better than adding pockets into the side seams because they are fully anchored into place. They're not going to flip around and they don't budge anywhere near as easily as they do in the side seams. I'm just so glad that I've learned how to sew pockets like this because they really elevate my sewing from something that looks a little bit more handmade to something that looks a little bit more like you could buy it. Next, I sewed together my shorts at the crotch seam and the side seams to make them wearable. This took quite a lot of adjustments to get right. I don't know why I do this, but I always end up making trousers a lot bigger than I mean them to be, and I have to slowly cut down the side seams until I get something that I like. This mainly happens because when I cut out my pieces, I always think they look too small, so I really overcompensate with how big I make them, thinking that I need a lot more seam allowance. I really need to get to the point where I have real pattern pieces that I have edited correctly to actually be the size that I want them to be, so that they are a lot more useful when going into another project, so I stop wasting all this fabric. Once I have my shorts in one piece, I could add on a partially elasticated waistband. Like with all my bottoms, I will be creating a partially elasticated waistband, so I will be able to wear these shorts even if my weight changes in the future. The waistband started out as 6 strips of fabric, 2 of which are the length of the back of my shorts, and 4 of which are the length of one side of the front of my shorts. These are then combined into 2 long strips which cover the entire circumference of my shorts, and are then sewn together along the top edge to create a nice sleek tube of fabric with an open end at the bottom. Once I had this tube created, I then sewed elastic into the back section. Lengthwise, I went with a piece 2/3 the length of the fabric, but I could have definitely gone a little bit bigger with this project as the shorts end up looking a little bit tight for me. They still fit and aren't uncomfortable, they just dig in a little bit more than I want them to, which I could see getting annoying if I wore them all day to a convention. Finally, I sewed the waistband onto the shorts itself. This is always quite tricky for me and I tend to break a lot of needles, but somehow for this project I managed to do it without breaking any needles, which I think is a first for me. Next, I added on the snap buttons so I could actually wear these shorts. I'm quite happy with how this turned out. A zip would definitely be a little bit more secure and I would feel less like they're going to open randomly, but I do think this works quite well for a cosplay piece that I'm not planning to wear on an everyday basis. After that, I then hemmed the bottom of my shorts by adding on an additional bias binding piece of fabric onto the bottom of them. I wanted to do it this way because it adds a little bit more length and it just makes them look a little bit more even all the way around. I find that rolling hems on shorts doesn't really work, they tend to flip over quite a lot, so this way I knew that the shorts weren't going to roll up as I wore them. Finally, I added the same chain detail that I added to the hood onto the sides of the shorts and completely forgot to actually hit the record button when doing so. I'm very glad this is part of the project that I've already done so that you do have some footage of me adding the chains. It's very frustrating. With that said, that is it for the process part of this video, so I can finally show you the final result. I am so happy with how this turned out. I feel like it's so much more unique than all the other Pokemon cosplays that I've done so far, and I really think that's down to the fact that I decided not to do a wig for this one. Having the hood really just makes it stand out, and it really shows off my skills so much better than having a wig that's badly styled. My wig work has just always been bad. The only thing I can really do with a wig is tie it in little bunches. Everything else I feel like just looks absolutely terrible. Even when I like wigs that I make at the time, I look back at them a few months later and really hate them. So this is a really good way of making this cosplay into something that I'm going to be happy with for a lot longer, and something that I'm just going to be a lot more comfortable wearing to conventions, because I'm not going to boil and it's not going to give me a massive headache, because wigs really give me headaches. I get really bad migraines from them. But let's talk about the actual design itself. I'm really happy that I went with the shiny fabric on the inside. I feel like it gives this magical vibe to it that I was really missing with just the black fabric. The circles, like I said before, came out really good, and I'm so glad that I used paint for these pieces now rather than trying to sew them. Sewing them would have just been a complete and utter nightmare. Another element that I really like is the chains. I've never done chains before, and I really do like how they look. It makes me want to add chains to more of my clothing. I feel like these would sound really awful in a washing machine, but maybe I could just take them off if I wanted to wash this, like take out the jump rings and just put them back in after the fact. I think that would be probably a better way of doing it, but I don't really mind doing that if I can add these really cool elements to pieces. I want to do something a little bit more intricate, I think, if I did this again. There's just so many possibilities that you could do with chains. With that said, that is it for this video. If you did enjoy it and you liked the final result, please give it a like down below. Comment what else you'd like me to do, maybe some other Pokemon that you'd like me to cosplay, and subscribe as I post a new video every single week, and I'd love to see you again. But until then, bye!